In the previous clip, you have learned that the attached property validation has error is set to true on the target element in case of a validation error. The attached property validation errors will contain a collection with all the validation errors that occurred on the data binding. In addition to these two properties, there is another attached property that is called validation error template. You can use this attached property to define a template that is used for the text box in case of an error. By default, this error template displays the red border that we have seen already in previous clips. Now let's specify our own error template. So in this demonstration, we will define an error template and we will display the error below the text box. Let's switch to Visual Studio and let's do it. Here in the UP.SAML file, we have our implicit style for text boxes. Now let's create a setter here and let's set the property validation error template. We want to assign a new value to that property and we need to assign a new control template. I want to use a stack panel and in the control template I place an adorned element placeholder. This element is a placeholder for the text box that uses this error template. Now there is one thing that you need to remember. You can't change the position of the text box with this error template. All you can do here is placing elements beside or even on top of the text box. In this case, I have used a stack panel that stacks elements vertically. So now I can add a text block here, and I set the font size to 12 and the foreground to red, and I just set the text property for now to error. As I'm using here a stack panel which stacks elements vertically by default, this text block will be below the adorned element placeholder. And as you know, that placeholder is the placeholder for the text box. So now let's run the application, let's select a friend, and let's type in Robert. Here we go, you see the little text error below this text box. Now let's see how we can display the real error. So for the text property, we also need to create a data binding. And we can bind now to this adorned element placeholder. So we can just give it a name. Let's call it placeholder. On the binding I use the element name property and I want to bind to the placeholder element. And now let's define the path property. The adorned element placeholder has an adorned element property. This property will contain the text box that is used by that placeholder. And on the text box, we have the attached validation errors property. So actually, we can just use this path here. We want to bind to the attached property validation errors, we grab the first one and its error content property. So I copy this, I write a dot here and I paste it. Now let's run the application again. Let's select a friend, let's type in Robert, and we see below the text box, robots are not valid friends. Great! So our validation works as expected and we have now used a custom validation error template. Now let's continue by refactoring our code a bit. In this demonstration you learn how to create a notify data error info base class. We will refactor the logic that we have in our friend wrapper class into this new base class. When we are done with this, we will also introduce a model wrapper class that makes it very simple to set and get properties from our friend wrapper. Finally, we will also trigger the validation in that model wrapper class and not directly in the friend wrapper where we do it now. So let's switch to Visual Studio and let's refactor our code a bit. Let's start with the notify data error info base class. First, let's open up the friend wrapper and let's look at the code. I go to Edit, Outlining, and I say Collapse to Definitions. When I scroll down, you can see this whole block is the implementation for our iNotify data error info interface. So let's just cut this whole code block and let's create here a new class that we call notify data error info base. And I paste the code here. I scroll up a bit and I inherit this class from ViewModelBase. I also implement the interface iNotify data error info. Now let's scroll up to the definition of the friend wrapper class. Instead of inheriting from ViewModelBase and instead of implementing this interface, we just inherit from our new NotifyDataErrorInfo base class. Here at the scroll bar you can see this little red square. It indicates an error. So let's expand the validate property method. Here you can see that the methods clear errors and add error are underlined in red. This is because these methods are implemented in the base class, but they are not visible here. So we need to change the access modifiers on these methods. So let's scroll down to our new NotifyDataErrorInfo base class, and let's just make the addError method protected and the clearErrors method protected as well. And let's also make the onErrorsChanged method protected virtual so that we could call it from the subclass. Now let's see if our application still works. I select a friend and I changed the first name to Robert. Okay, cool, the validation still works. Now I place the cursor behind the glass and I press Ctrl-. This allows me to move that glass to its own file. I remove the empty lines here in the friend wrapper, and now you can see that we have this NotifyDataErrorInfo base file. This contains now our new NotifyDataErrorInfo base class. Now let's see what else we can refactor. The friend wrapper class has a model property which is of type friend. In the firstName property of our friend wrapper, we are accessing the firstName property of the wrapped model, in the getter and also in the setter. As the property on the wrapped model has the same name as the property of our wrapper, we could use some reflection to get and set the properties of the model. Let's try to build this in a base class. So let's add here a new class that we call ModelWrapper. The first thing I want to move to that base class is the model property and the constructor. So I just cut the model property and the constructor and I paste it into the base class. I rename the constructor to ModelWrapper, and of course I don't want to have the friend class in that ModelWrapper class. So I make the ModelWrapper class generic, then I can use the generic type for the constructor parameter and also for the type of the model property. Now I inherit my ModelWrapper class from NotifyDataErrorInfo base, and then I can inherit the friend wrapper from ModelWrapper of friend. I press Ctrl-. to generate the friend wrapper constructor that calls the base constructor with the friend model. Now we can go to the getters and setters of our properties. Let's start with the getter of the firstName property. Instead of accessing the model property directly, we could also call a method that we call getValue. Let's make it generic, we need a string, and the parameter is name of firstName. I press Ctrl-. to generate that friend wrapper getValue method. Here we go, we have the getValue method. I change the parameter to string property name, and I make it optional, and I also set the column member name attribute on that parameter. I need a using for system runtime compiler services. Now I can omit that firstName string here. Before we implement this getValue method, let's cut it from here and let's move it to our ModelWrapper base class. I changed the generic type parameter to tValue and the return value as well, otherwise it would collide with the generic type parameter of the ModelWrapper class. I also make the method protected virtual, so that the subclass can see it and optionally a subclass can override it. Now let's try to return the value for the specified property name from that getValue method. So here I say return, and first I grab the type of our model. Then I call the getProperty method and I pass in the name of our property that we receive here as a parameter. This getProperty method returns a property info object, and that property info object has a getValue method that just requires the object from which we want to get the value for that property. We have the object in the model property. Now this code statement is underlined because getValue returns an object. Here we just need to cast it into tValue, and now our getValue method is fine. And our firstName property is using it already. Now we can scroll down to the lastName property, and we can use it here as well. And we can even use it in our email property. Now we have this getValue method to get a value for a property. Let's try to implement also a setValue method that we can use to set the value of a property. Let's go up to the model wrapper again, and let's just copy that getValue method, and let's name it setValue. Let's also change the return value to void, and we need an additional parameter on that method for the value that should be set on the property. So let's add here a parameter of type tValue that we call justValue. Inside of the method, we don't need a return value, and we don't need that casting. Instead of calling the getValue method, we call the setValue method, and we want to set this value on our model. Now we have used reflection to assign a value to a property of our model. Let's also call the onPropertyChanged method here to raise the property changed event for that property name. Now we are done with the setValue method. Let's scroll down to the properties of the friend wrapper. Here in the setter of the firstName property, we can just call for these two lines our new setValue method and passing in the value. I just copy that method and I scroll down to the lastName property. I use it here as well, and I use it as well in our email property. Okay, quite nice. Now I place the cursor on the model wrapper class, I press Ctrl Dot and I move the type to its own file. Now we have here the friend wrapper that inherits from model wrapper that inherits itself from notify data error info base. Let's run the application and let's see if it still works. I select the friend, okay, first name and last name are displayed, I change the first name to Robert, and we get the validation. Cool, so the application still works. Now let's see how we can still refactor that validate property method that we have defined directly in our friend wrapper class.